hope you're doing well. It's a beautiful day here in sunny California. I've got same coffee. I've recorded 3 of these episodes kind of back to back. It's always interesting how coffee changes flavor as it cools. This one has got a little bit more cacao hints now that it's cooled compared to some of the brighter notes whenever I first started drinking it. So in my last video, I talked about award nominees and winners, and I discussed James, which was a Pulitzer Prize winner in that one, and helped me identify a major through line through many of the books. And James got me thinking about another type of specific book, the retelling of a famous book from another character's perspective. So I remember reading Grendel during British literature in high school and really finding it interesting. And it also was what got me into my first creative writing. We had to do an assignment saying, now go off and write from a different character's perspective, the story of Beowulf, which I wrote from the dragon's perspective. So Grendel, this is the other book that we're talking about, was written by John Gardner and published in 1971. And, it was the first book I've read of this type of genre. I know there's other ones, but I think that this is kind of an interesting perspective because, I've read 2 of these, but the way that the authors both decide to inject philosophy into these characters' perspective in a way that adds a lot of depth that's not there with the original characters, I think is interesting. So in Grendel, if you don't remember, is the monster in Beowulf. He's the inciting incident that brings the famed hero to the halls of Hrothgar, the king of the Danes. And this book very intentionally puts him at odds with the hero by making him something of an existentialist. I would argue that Beowulf is very much a hero, like a traditional heroic, like godly type figure, almost a Herculean type figure. You could think of the 3 things that he does within those books as a series of Herculean tasks, where before that he did this famous swim, and then he did this, kills Grendel, and then he kills his mother, and then he kills his dragon. They're kind of Herculean in their epicness, or Gilgamesh in some ways. And Grendel is very different from that, both the perspective that's provided and the character himself. He has just a pure existential view on things. He is a narcissist and a pessimist as well. And I really think his strain of pessimism is built around his narcissism, and he could definitely use some therapy. He thinks that there's no rational reason for existence. Nothing cares about him. Nothing cares if he lives or dies. And this includes his mother, who is alive throughout the entire book. But she is, insane in this story, so she's not really there. She's more beast than creature. And I'm using creature in terms of she's more of a monster than a creature, in terms of like the way that I talked about it in the Frankenstein video, where Grendel is a creature. He is a thinking being that has emotions and can talk and is an emotional counterpoint to the characters, whereas Grendel's mother is nameless and is defined by anger, emotions, and just raw anger. And she is bestial or monstrous, and in the way that she's described, rather than a creature. I read this book after reading James that I probably wouldn't have picked up otherwise. I could tell that based on the language and the sentiment in the beginning of the book, that it was written by a white man who is mostly concerned with white man problems. In the same way that I could tell James was written by a black man with a deep understanding of the profound problems that lay in front of his main character, I could just tell that these were just so far opposed in like the scope of concerns. James was written by Percival Everett, published on May 19th of 2024. It's a book written from the perspective of James from the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And I'm going to refer to him as James in this discussion because that is the name he picked for himself. And he rejects his enslaved name, which is the name that Huck Finn called him. And so I'm going to do that kind of out of the dignity of, like, that's his dead name in some ways. And it's also a statement against the fact that there are no good masters, and he rejects anything that they claim over him, especially by the name that they gave him. James is the name that other enslaved people call him. It is the name he chooses and the name he calls himself in the book, and as he contemns Judge Thatcher at the very end of the book. The very first sentences feels like this book couldn't have been written by a white man. There's just a deep understanding of what it is to be an enslaved person that would have required so much digging and so much kind of understanding of the similarities of people in the carceral system to the enslaved system, that it just really feels like it was written by a black man. Here's an excerpt from it. Those little bastards were hiding out there in the tall grass. The moon was not quite full but bright, and it was behind them, so I could see them plain as day, though it was deep night. Lightning bugs flashed against the black canvas. I waited at Miss Watson's kitchen door, rocked a loose step-board with my foot. Knew she was going to tell me to fix it in the morning. I was waiting there for her to give me a pan of cornbread that she made with my Sadie's recipe. Waiting is a big part of a slave's life. Waiting and waiting to wait some more. Waiting for demand, waiting for food, waiting for the end of days. Waiting for the just and deserved Christian reward at the end of it all. Compare that with the first few sentences of Grendel. The ram stood looking down over the rock slides, stupidly triumphant. I blinked. I stare in horror. Scat! I hiss. Go back to your cave. Go back to your cowshed, whatever. He cocks his head like an elderly, slow-witted king. Considers the angles. Decides to ignore me. I stamp. I hammer the ground with my fists. I hurl a skull-sized stone at him. He does not budge. I shake my hairy fists at the sky, and I let out a howl so unspeakable that the water at my feet turns sudden ice, and even I am left uneasy. But the ram stays. The season is upon us, and so begins the 12th year of my idiotic war. There's something of an acceptance, but in willingness to decide to act with James' opening lines that is almost like his intention of playing with a broken stair to intentionally irritate and highlight the noise to his, master, but not doing anything about it is a type of resistance and a type of feeding into the stereotypes that white people have of enslaved people. And while Grendel, it feels like, there's futility there. And it feels like someone who is angry with some sort of rage about something that he doesn't understand why he has this rage. And the power that he has terrifies him in a way that James can never have that sort of power, can never understand it because of the different perspectives in his life. And Grendel feels like he has no outlet for that anger. and there's no way to direct it. And, I watched Schnee's video about masculinity in Stranger Things, and talks about kind of the different ways that you can talk about or kind of use anger. And there's definitely a white man rage that he talks about that Grendel is emblematic of in a lot of ways. And I feel that Grendel is that white man that has, he has the power. He has, despite being an outcast, he is the most powerful being in this community, in this area. And, he, despite being a monster, he, with nails and furs and sharp teeth, he's very much a scorned white man. He's an outcast of his community. He's a man who is not able to access the privilege that he believes he has. So you can think of him as like a poor white man who isn't able to access the same privileges that someone of his power should have. He believes he should be welcome at Hrothgar's table, even though he is a monster. Believes he should be able to join in the boast as the mead hall, and resents the fact that he cannot. That is a white man's thing that happens with whenever you hear like the grievances of the far right. I think Everett does a masterful job outlining the allowed types of anger to an enslaved man, which in many ways has continued for black men in general. Things that a white man can get away with, like the chaos that Grendel causes, would be unacceptable in a black man. They would have hunted him down. They would have called for help. They would have formed up a militia and hunted him down. Grendel would have chased to his cave and would have had, some sort. They would have known where he was coming from, and figured out a way to warn the community. If he was coded as black, but he was coded as white, he basically, there was nothing anybody could do. I mean, granted, it was also because there was literally nothing he could do. He was enchanted by the dragon, which made him impervious to swords and slings and things like that. But, everyone was terrified of him except for Unferth, who, was humiliated by Grendel. And one of the big differences is that, like, the impact of death to these different characters. Grendel thought life of these humans was basically cheap, despite the fact that he felt his own life was worth something, but it didn't feel like the universe respected him, and it didn't feel like he was acknowledged by the world around him. And so he was at odds with that, where he was slaughtering people willy-nilly, but he was trying to find value in his own life. James doesn't have that sort of luxury because he has to carry the death of Huck Finn throughout the entire book. He has to keep Huck Finn alive, so in case he is found later with Huck Finn, he can be cleared of that murder. He's carrying the burden of being a runaway slave and a murderer. He knew what would happen with him if he was caught. He would be strung up and murdered, and especially if Finn wasn't there to protect him. And throughout this story, James is sold multiple times on this trip, with each was catastrophic in its own way. But he only chose to be sold once because he thought that ultimately it would help him and his friend, because it would provide them money and allow them to continue on with their journey, and they would be able to get one over on a slave master. And he was able to save another person despite her dying in the process, but it allowed her to die free. And I think, and James knew that she was happy dying free rather than dying and being raped in slavery. And I think that James was really a solid book. He didn't really need to play with the structure of the story. It was basically ran parallel to the story. Grendel was different. It actually had non-traditional novel structures, like several chapters were written as if it was a play, which was Grendel's way of telling a story of unrest in Hrothgar's hall with his nephews and two children, kind of looking at the succession in the kingdom of Hrothgar, and the ways that people were playing each other against each other, and how what Grendel was watching. And then the last third of Grendel kind of bounced around these different storytelling structures, as if to highlight everything in the text as being rather absurd, or the absurdity of everything in text, rather than giving the reader a straight story. And this change comes after we learn that Grendel hated the sight of the queen's vagina, or hole as he calls it. He kind of like, I think in some ways he wanted to try and claim the queen as his own, and then because she was on her period, whenever he was going to tear her apart or rape her, or it's not, he doesn't think he's going to do anything to her, like he's just pulling her apart and nobody can do anything, and he just sees this thing that he hates, and it's clearly white man's misogyny over somebody he can't control, and it causes him to flee, and I think that causes him to fracture even more, and it's represented in the structure of the story. I do love the very last sentence of Grendel. It's a very good sentence. I mean, in Beowulf, he gets his arm ripped off and dies. It's the only way that you can really kill him is by pulling something out of him. And it ends with Grendel muttering to these forest creatures around him, "Poor Grendel's had an accident, so may you all." Which I think is a pretty fitting end to the book. The other thing that I noticed is that there is a reference to Kurt Vonnegut in the story, because whenever Grendel kills a couple people, he says, "and so it goes," which is something Vonnegut does in like Cat's Cradle and Slaughterhouse-Five, and it references kind of I think it's more in Slaughterhouse-Five where it is more just the absurdity and the unrealness and just absurdness of war and death, and there's no reason why this person or that person died. And it's the same thing that Grendel is doing. He is this monstrous outside force that is causing these absurd deaths. I enjoyed rereading Grendel. I'd forgotten about the play structure about 2/3 through the book. It's a good book if you've never read it. I think you would probably find it interesting. Personally, I found James to be just a significantly stronger book, but they're written 50 years apart. They represent different anxieties at the time. They're also different types of people writing about different people, and I think that they're providing unique context in both ways. And Grendel is dealing with an insecurity that a lot of white men deal with now, whereas James is dealing with the insecurities of an educated black man in today's society, which I think is fascinating to read about. They both take a great story and add a unique twist to it, and I really do think that I prefer the deep wisdom within James. James is such an intelligent and wise and an empathic character that is just deeply humanizing. And I love the way that he had to code switch. If you're not familiar with code switching is like in Sorry to Bother You, where the black characters create their white voice whenever they're calling white people and and explain, selling something to them or answering questions. That happens whenever a lot of black people are at work, where they will talk differently than what they talk to their black friends. And in this case, the code switching is different, where James has to hide his intelligence from his masters, but he can be his intelligent, true self only with the enslaved people. And I really find it interesting, and it terrifies the white people whenever they hear him speaking his true self. And I really thought that was fantastic, and it really humanized James, and I thought it was amazing. Grendel, on the other hand, is a person who has so much physical power, so much rage, but he's not getting what he wants, and he just lashes out at the world, claims it's all existential. But really, James, and all the horrors that he lives through, is such a healthy person that I don't know how he is. He is just a paragon for his community. Have you read either of these books? What do you think of this type of book, of an author taking a spin on a pop famous book like this? Is there a book like this that I should read? I know there's more of these out there. Give me a like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think about all these books. Did I miss something? Did I grossly misunderstand Grendel or grossly misunderstand James? I'm sure there was a lot of things in James that I didn't pick up, but I really liked it. I highly recommend both these books if you want to see interesting stories told based off of classic books. And I want to thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your time. It means a lot for you to spend your time with me. Thank you very much.